Dick Samuels is the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT. He is the author of a whole slug of books on Japanese politics going back into the early 1980s, has worked on Japanese domestic politics, political economy, the administrative state, security policy, defense policy. His newest book is called Securing Japan. It is forthcoming from Cornell University Press. Will it make it in 2006? Probably not, 2007. So it'll be 2007 from Cornell University Press. But you don't have to worry about that because he's here today to give you a little bit of a preview of some of the arguments in that book and some of the empirical material that he's gathered in writing the book. Professor Samuel's talk is Securing Japan in a Dangerous Neighborhood. So a takeoff on the simpler title of the book, Securing Japan. And I'd like you all to join me in welcoming him to BYU.
Thanks very much, Wade. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to talk with you about the book, but I'll be happy to talk with you about things not in the book if you ask. So we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, I hope. What I'm going to do today is walk you through a very quick review of the past, that is, where Japan had been in security affairs until very recently. Give you a snapshot of where I think the present is, and then try to suggest possibilities for the future. And with each of the possibilities I suggest, try to attach to them what Japanese posture would be, a military and diplomatic posture would be. So we start with the past. And one way to characterize, and this is the recent past, this is that the book actually goes back to the late 19th century, and Professor Jacoby talked me out of dragging that in here today, which I'm thankful for him for having stopped me before I did it again. But I like to I practice history without a license, and I really do like to connect dots across centuries. I'm not going to do that today, but if you ask me, I might. When I talk about the past here today, I'm really only talking about the Cold War past, the past of the last, say, 60-ish, 65-ish years. And I characterize that as cheap writing realism. The Japanese didn't have a free ride on the American security guarantee, not by a long shot. They paid quite a bit to keep the American military there, both in terms of their own sovereignty, which I'll talk about in a bit, but in terms of hard cash, which I'll also talk about in a bit. But it was a period when they determined it would be better not to be Dai Nippon, Greater Japan, the Great Japan of the 1930s and the 1940s, but Shon Nihon, small Japan, a small island trading nation. To go back to principles that were first articulated in the 1920s, really, by people who were considered small Japan liberals, who believed that the military solutions, military aggression, military occupation of the continent was not really Japan's interest, that they could achieve more for the Japanese themselves by trade and engagement with China. There are debates here that are echoing in this room, in this country today, echoing across Asia today. That's why I say I like the history. In any event, that's not the way Japan went, as you know. Japan went the military route, and the man who was the personification of that military route was a guy named Yamagata Aritomo. And I start with Yamagata's ghost because it was the failure of the military solution, the failure of the military first foreign and security policy that hung over Japan for the past 65 years in a very profound way. Every time the Japanese talked among themselves and perhaps with their American ally about being more realistic about international affairs, about playing a role in international security affairs, immediately the editorialists and the critics, mostly on the left, would stand up and say, we don't trust ourselves. We shouldn't trust ourselves. Japanese democracy is immature. Japan is not ready for this. It was all about Yamagata's ghost. It was the ghost of militarists past. And they shaped and they intimidated, really, the debate in a way that kept things at a steady state, what's known as the Yoshida Doctrine. Yoshida Shigeru was the prime minister, the early post-war prime ministers most associated with this idea, the idea being that Japan should not only be a small island trading nation, but should not have an active military. And he embraced Article 9 of the Constitution and he was a conservative, to be sure, but he reached out to the left, and together they embraced the maintenance of Article 9 of the Constitution, something which we'll have to come back and talk about. Along the way, there was an accretion, what I call, and here I will confess to you front up that I'm metaphorically challenged. I'm not good with metaphors. At least I'm good with them, but I use them at cross purposes. So I'll give you, the first metaphor is this pacifist loaf. What Yoshida Shigeru and his successors, who were in the centrist part of the LDP, did was to build and bake this large loaf of pacifism, which said Article 9 is inviolate, we're not going to revise the Japanese constitution, and by the way, we are not going to adopt nuclear weapons, so we have 3 non-nuclear principles that we wouldn't introduce, we wouldn't maintain, and we wouldn't develop nuclear weapons. We are not going to have more than 1% of our GDP spent on defense, so we're going to limit our defense budgets. All of this is basically tying their own hands and be doing it in a way to build confidence with their neighbors, to build confidence among the Chinese, among the Koreans, but also to reassure the Americans that the cork, to use an infelicitous phrase used first by a U.S. general, the cork would not come out of the Japanese bottle. Basically, they didn't trust themselves in a way that I think has become counterproductive. But anyway, I'm describing the past. They banned the sale of defense products, so the Japanese arms industry is quite stunted. It's a dual-use industry. It's the same firms that make tractors make tanks, but they don't make lots of them for the military. And so there was a limited amount of spin-off from military production into the civilian economy in Japan. To the contrary, there's a great deal of spin-on from the civilian economy to the military economy. And I've written about that in a book, if you're interested, called Rich Nation, Strong Army. But in any event, they stopped themselves from selling arms in the international marketplace. They prevented there being a defense ministry. There's instead, and there still is to this day, although I won't vouch for next week, because, watch this space. I'll get to this. But as of today, there is no defense ministry in Japan. They have a $40 to $45 billion defense budget, but no defense ministry. They have a defense agency which sits within the prime minister's office. And that was another mechanism. That was an institutional, bureaucratic mechanism to keep the lid on, to prevent them from becoming what they once were, which is as if that were the only choice. You see, it was a false choice they presented to themselves, it seems to me. They would have a self-defense force. They would not have a military. They would have a self-defense force, and it would be reliable and warm-hearted. And that's a direct quote from the white paper, the defense white paper. So, I teach a course on Japanese security at MIT, and always in the front row, every time I teach the course in the front row, there's someone from the defense agency, there I go, from the defense agency, from the Ministry of Finance, from Keidanren, which is a business interest group organization, from the foreign ministry, usually 2 of those. And they're all sitting there, they're taking notes, faxing back, what did he say this time, kind of stuff. I can live with that. But what was interesting one year, it was about 10 years ago now, a young woman, diplomat from the foreign ministry, raised her hand on the first day. I was barely through the first paragraph of my lecture. I was talking about the Japanese military, and she said, Professor Samuels, you really have to stop. She says, you can't talk about a Japan. We don't have a military. We have a self-defense force. And I looked at her, and I thought to myself, calm yourself, Dick. I said, calm down. This is really a great teaching opportunity. And it was, because what the opportunity was twofold. One was I could talk to her about how transparently, what's the word? Duplicitous is not the right word, but transparently insincere, it seemed, for the Japanese who are spending $40 billion a year on things that go bang in the night to say that they don't have a military. And to call it a self-defense force, it's a little disingenuous. That's the word I was looking for. On the one hand, but on the other hand, the students in the class, most of whom were Americans, it was an opportunity to teach them how sensitive the Japanese still are about things military. So that was, 10-ish years ago. Fast forward 2 years, I taught the course again in the front row, same bunch of folks, it's a different bunch of folks, same institutional affiliations with one exception. There was a guy there who raised his hand and said, my name, I won't use his name, but my name, let's call him Sato. It wasn't Sato. My name is Sato. I'm an admiral, and I'm a retired admiral in the Japanese Navy. And I said, bravo. things had changed. Now he could talk about a Navy, not a maritime self-defense force. He was willing to sort of, be upfront about what is really one of the most modern and muscular military organizations in the world. Certainly one of the most modern and muscular military organizations in the Far East. So as reliable and warm-hearted as it may wish to be, it is a serious player. And it became a serious player and this is where I'm mixing my metaphor. I told you I was going to do this, right? So we had a pacifist loaf, now we're slicing a salami, okay? So the salami slicing, salami slicing is an interesting concept because it's German. The term in German, and it sounds English, but it's not, it's salami tactic. It's the slicing of the salami strategically in order to get, the Germans thought at the end of the Cold War that it was time for the German government to get the German people used to the idea that Germany could play a role in international security affairs. That wasn't cool. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Did I hit you all? You okay there? All right. That's not going to work. Sorry. I'll go thirsty. So the Germans, Volker Ruhe, who was the defense minister in Germany, announced that, look, we're going to, piece by piece, we're going to get the German people comfortable with the idea that, they're not their grandparents. And, it's a new world, and it's a post-Cold War world, and it's one in which Germany has a legitimate role to play in international affairs, particularly international security affairs. And so they sliced the salami tactic. The Japanese have been doing the same thing. They've been doing it slowly, and they've been doing it, in fits and starts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but they've been doing it. And so this is a list. I won't go into all of the items on the list, except to say, look, the first part of it was sending the minesweepers to the Persian Gulf at the end of the first Gulf War. They were too little. They were too late. They paid $13 billion. I'll come back to this. Because basically they did it with their checkbook rather than with their military. And that didn't work out real well for the Japanese. The PKO law was legislation that was finally passed after a lot of, to use the German again, Sturm und Drang, to sort of get the Japanese people to accept the notion that they could participate in United Nations sanctioned peacekeeping operations. So first they went to Cambodia, they've been in the Gaza Strip, they've been to East Timor, to Honduras. They have been playing at a low level, but they've been playing in peacekeeping operations. In 1996, after Kim Jong-il, his first shenanigans on nuclear arms, and the agreed framework was being negotiated and so forth, it was discovered that the United States and Japan really didn't have mechanisms at the operational level for the joint use of force in the Korean contingency, and it sort of shook people up on both sides. And so soon thereafter, the Japanese and the Americans renegotiated the alliance agreement, and Japan agreed to extend its strategic borders from homeland security, which it had been all this time, that is from the end of the war until 1995-6, to regional security. So in Japanese, they shuhen, the area around Japan, shuhen. Of course, some Japanese immediately started saying, well, shuhen's not a geographical expression. I don't know what it is if it's not geographical. But the point is 2 steps forward, 1 back, trying to be as light on their toes as possible because it's something new. They were slicing the salami. By 1999, they were signing on to regional cooperation agreements for maritime interdiction, which means, there's pirates in Southeast Asia, by Indonesia, Malaysia, the Straits of Malacca, the areas that are choke points for Japanese commerce, really for the whole world in many important respects. And the Japanese agreed to participate through their Coast Guard. Last time I checked, the Straits of Malacca are not near the Japanese coast. Some of you may want to check the map, but it's not even remotely close to the But there it is. So they have the Coast Guard down there doing its thing, which is fine. It's another step forward in the Japanese assumption of a legitimate security role in the region. And of course, 9/11 changed everything in a very fundamental way, because after 9/11, then Prime Minister Koizumi wasted no time at all, in a remarkable and really quite surprising speed, wasted no time in agreeing to support American and British forces fighting in Afghanistan, and then later, so that's the destroyers to Diego Garcia. It wasn't just destroyers, it was tankers supplying fuel to combatants, which is something that many people believed was contrary to the Japanese Constitution. He just did it. And in 2004, finally doing something really quite extraordinary from most of our perspectives, unprecedented, putting boots on the ground in Iraq during a conflict, in the safest possible place. It's an area where it was safe. And they say, well, how do you know it's safe? He says, because that's the area we're sending them. It was lovely. And, he said that in Diet, you know. Okay. But then it went further. In 2004, there was a relaxation of the arms export ban. It was a small relaxation. It was a relaxation in the context of missile defense with the United States. But very important relaxation because it opened the door. And it said, we are relaxing our ability to sell military developed technologies and military equipment to the United States in this case, but we're also reserving the right to do it again on a case-by-case basis in the future. Very important, because now it's basically a different kind of a restriction than it has ever been. In fact, this year, they began using ODA money, that is official development assistance funds, to pay for Coast Guard ships developed for military purposes, that is police purposes. Let's use the Japanese distinction. Police purposes, but they're using aid money to provide those boats to Malaysia, to Indonesia, I guess to Malaysia and to Indonesia. So you're beginning to see more of this sort of thing. And there's more in the works. The elevation of the Japan Defense Agency to a Ministry of Defense, that's why I was joking before. I said as of this week, it's still an agency. But the legislation was originally, that is, would elevate the defense agency to a defense ministry, was submitted last spring. They ran out of time in the last Diet session, but it's being reintroduced this week. And all expectations, and the Japanese press this morning was reporting that all expectations are it will pass because the main opposition party, the Democratic Party of Japan, supports the idea. So if the main opposition party supports the idea and the LDP still has an overwhelming majority in Diet, the agency is going to be a ministry, and soon. Okay, so so I've basically brought us up to the present. Let me talk a little bit and very briefly about the domestic political landscape. I really want to make sure we have time for Q&A. There's a couple of points, and they're consistent with what I was saying. They're all suggested by what I've already said. One is that the LDP pragmatists have been marginalized. By the LDP pragmatists, I'm talking about the center of the LDP, the conservative ruling party in Japan. These are the descendants of Yoshida Shigeru, the ones who baked the pacifist loaf. Those guys have been muscled out. They are no longer anywhere close to the center of LDP power. LDP is still in power. Indeed, it has an enormous majority in Diet. But that part of the LDP that had found common cause with the left, that had embraced Article 9 of the Constitution, that had built the pacifist loaf, they are on the sidelines. Instead, it's the normal nationalists, and I have that with a hyphen, because the people have been talking about Japan and becoming a more normal nation, by which they mean the ability to play a role in international security affairs, the ability to have a military, to call it a military, the ability to participate in coalitions of the willing, for example, as equals. Those guys, they're in power. So that's further on the right of the LDP. Sometimes they're called the revisionist part of the LDP. They're the ones who took power away from Yoshida, that is, their grandfathers did, Kishi Nobusuke, Hatoyama, and so forth. They took power away from the Yoshida types for a short time in the 1950s. Then they lost power for the 60s and 70s and 80s. But by the 90s, they've consolidated power. And the guy who was first representative of this part of the party was Nakasone Yasuhiro. But long after Nakasone, the guy who really is responsible for consolidating their power was Koizumi Junichiro, who just left and handed the baton, I should say, to his successor, Abe Shinzo, who is literally Kishi's grandson. His grandfather was Kishi Nobusuke, who was the iconic figure of the revisionists, the right wing of the LDP. And when he talks in his book, Utsukushi Nihon-e, Utsukushi Kunie, when he talks about Japan, and he talks about his lineage, he talks about his grandfather, mostly. So it's that part of the party, and they're in power. The opposition, the formal opposition, is quite weak and deeply divided internally. That is the Democratic Party of Japan, because it was kludged together from socialists, the old right-wing socialists, and a bunch of disaffected LDP guys. And they've never really been able to find sure footing for themselves. So if the center of the LDP has been marginalized, the opposition has really been cast out. And the left is really, it just doesn't exist anymore in Japan. The socialists and the communists each have single-digit representation in the lower house of the Diet. I mean, this is from a time when they had together, 50, they governed it, at half the population of Japan lived in localities that were governed by socialists or communists. A third of the Diet were socialists. It's all gone. That part of Japanese politics, that Cold War part of Japanese politics is long gone. And the bureaucracy is no longer first among equals in the Japanese policy constellation, in the firmament. They're important players. They're very important players, but the political leadership has found a way to reorganize Japanese government by enhancing the powers of the Prime Minister's office in particular, but in other ways to try to wrest power from the bureaucratic stovepipes that in Japanese tatewari you'll say, the vertical administration, the stovepipes, the separate bureaucratic organisms that had trouble coordinating but that ruled within their own domains. That's gone. And public support for the military, and I say SDF, I should say military in the context of the story I told you, has never been higher. It's now accepted as legitimate. And there's a new world order, as you all know, and there has been for some time. I'm talking now about the post-Cold War, but beyond. Nothing really is as it was, as you know. There is no balance of power in the world. Countries realists will tell you that countries are going to begin active or have already begun actively balancing against the U.S. That's not going real well for them. There's a new balance of power regionally with the rise of China, a non-trivial event in historic terms, in world history terms. And altogether, as we all know so well and so sadly, new security threats, particularly proliferation and terrorism. And so Japan is more muscular than it ever has been, as I've already suggested. They can now reach out and touch adversaries in ways that they couldn't in the past by acquiring equipment that was deemed unconstitutional in the past. Now, the constitutional interpreters of the Cabinet Legislation Bureau, it's called Naikaku Hosei Kyoku in Japanese, these bureaucrats now are forced to look the other way as Japan gets aerial refueling capabilities, as it participates in theater missile defense, as it acquires assault ships. And not just assault ships with hardened lids, so that you can put airplanes, not just helicopters, on them. If they're Harriers, they're short. They have reaffirmed their right to preemptive military action in the context of an imminent threat. Now, that's not new. That's something that Mr. Kishi actually made sure was a formal interpretation of the Constitution back in the 1950s. But there it is. They've begun practicing what they're calling remote island defense, and that means Marines. I mean, that means bringing people and landing them against hostile fire. Remote island defense is, you'll know the Japanese have a air self-defense force, ground self-defense force, and a maritime self-defense force. They have no Marine. There's no Marine Corps. But now, maritime self-defense force sailors are practicing remote island defense. They're participating in ballistic missiles. That's, by the way, that's all Senkaku related. That's related to territorial disputes that they have with the Chinese, which we'll come back to. And they're building a central readiness command. So they're getting themselves prepared for a different era, the kind of changes that I've already described, and for playing, in particular, a global security role. Through PSI, which is the Proliferation Security Initiative, that's an American initiative, which allows members of the PSI, participants in the PSI, to interdict ships on the high seas. They say, well, we'll hold your coat while you do it, but they're getting closer to being able to do it themselves. And this is about North Korea now, and preventing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. They talk now about those ships that were going out to Diego Garcia. Now they're talking semi-permanent patrols out to the Gulf itself. Very different than anything we've seen in the past. I have UNSC, the United Nations Security Council, with a question mark, because that was a diplomatic offensive that they took last year. It was very ill-conceived, and they were beat up pretty badly in the effort. They tried to do it with the Germans, the Indians, and the Brazilians, and since the Italians wouldn't put up with having the Germans there, and the Chinese wouldn't put up with having the Japanese, and the Pakistanis wouldn't put up with having the Indians, and the Argentines wouldn't put up with having the Brazilians, it was, you know, four ways to overdetermine the failure of an initiative. It didn't work. But they're still at it, and they still would like to be recognized in the UN Security Council. And the Coast Guard as a new military power. Let me come back to that, because that's a whole other conversation, and even though I'm speaking fast, I'm running out of time. So they're doing all this, so it's more muscular than it's ever been before. But again, you know, it's sort of warm and fuzzy. There's a happy face to the Japanese military. So, you know, there's this Prince Pickles. Anyone ever see Prince Pickles? Okay, so you've seen Prince Pickles. Okay, so that's Prince Pickles. And, you know, there are mascots, and it's cute. Japan is cute. Everyone knows cute Japan, right? Right? Hello Kitty, right? This is Hello Kitty meets the U.S. Marine Corps. There's Prince Pickles over here. You gotta love this guy. He's the mascot. And so, happy face, Prince Pickles. Gene Kelly and Donald O'Connor are performing. Actually, I really urge you all to check this out on the web, because this doesn't, I should have put in, this is a PowerPoint presentation, but if we had done it on the web, I could have actually shown you the video. It is very cool. They're dancing, and it's like, you know, they're in Paris, Americans in Paris, and seamanship, and they're singing seamanship for love and seamanship for peace, and it's, at the bottom it says Kaijo Jietai, so it's the Maritime Self-Defense Force, sort of. Anyway, the point is that it's not, you know, be all that you can be, you know, with mud on your face and struggling. It's about all the contributions and good things that, okay, you get it. So how did this all come to be? Well, again, as I said before, there are lots of, I had a graduate, in graduate school, I had a professor who was really quite brilliant, and he said if there was ever a single explanation, a single reason for a political event, it surely never happened. And this is one of those, this is more evidence that he's right. I mean, everything in a way, in its own way, is overdetermined. And so Japan's becoming more muscular. It's not just that the Cold War ended. It's not just that there was a first Gulf War and they felt embarrassed by their inability to respond in a timely and full way. And it's not just all the other things I'm going to tell you in a second. It's lots of things. Okay, overdetermination. So the first Gulf War, they paid $13 billion. The only country in the world that taxed its citizens to pay for the Gulf War was Japan. They did it. And then when Kuwait put in a full double page, maybe full page ad in the New York Times to thank all the members of the coalition that George Herbert Walker Bush had put together to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, Japan was left out. It just wasn't included. And so every document subsequent to that the Japanese military, the Japanese foreign ministry has produced about Japan's defense is that they talk about the humiliation of checkbook diplomacy. You see it everywhere. Now, it's very convenient. So maybe it's more, it's the utility of the humiliation of checkbook diplomacy than it is simply the humiliation itself. But whatever it is, they felt like they missed the bus, and that they simply they paid but didn't get thanked and didn't have anything to show for it. But the second catalyst surely is 9/11. And U.S. exhortations. U.S. exhortations for Japan to do more, shoulder the burden, bear the burden, you know, do all of this. We've been talking with the Japanese about this since the 1970s. It's not new. But 9/11, the rhetoric heated up. And so there was language, two particular phrases stuck in the media, show the flag and boots on the ground. This cartoon comes out of the Tokyo Shimbun, I think it was. And the guy on the ringmaster here, this is a left-wing version of what was going on, is Rich Armitage, who was then Deputy Secretary of State. And what Armitage is doing is he's cracking the whip. That's Prime Minister Koizumi, the lion. And Koizumi, it says Jietai on it, it's the self-defense forces. And he's jumping over the fence of Article 9. So he's overcoming this barrier of Article 9. And Armitage is saying, show the flag, and boots on the ground, and over the fence. So, you know, move on. So it's exhortation. but it's also an event, a galvanizing event of 9/11. I'm sorry? Yeah, I say Article 9 of the Constitution. Right, he's jumping over the constraint. Right, exactly. But there's one catalyst that's right out of central casting. I mean, you know, if you wanted a villain and you were at Warner Brothers and you wanted to cast a really bad guy, you know, enter stage right, far, far, far right, Kim Jong-il. I mean, you know, the DPRK was tailor-made for Japan, for those in Japan who wanted to do more on the military. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. You know, they're nasty, they're opaque, they kidnap your people. They're, you know, they just are real bad guys. And I'm not being cute about this. They really are bad guys. And so it really works. So for a while, Japan couldn't say openly, well, we're preparing our military for a world in which China is risen. And we want to be able to balance Chinese power. They didn't say that. They didn't say there's a China threat. It's DPRK. It's the North Korean threat. It's North Korea. And of course, the North Koreans made it so easy. The crisis I already told you about in the mid-90s. Then, of course, tossing a missile over sovereign airspace, over Japan, basically, in 1998, led to, within 1 week, this was really the interesting thing, this is September 30th, 1998, I believe was the date. The North Koreans tested a Taepodong rocket over Japanese airspace. Japan had for 20 years, 25 years, a ban on the military use of space. It's one of those things where they were tying their hands, like no export of weapons, 1% of GDP, limit on the defense budget. We tie our hands, no military use of space. A week after that missile flew over Japanese territory, there was a diet law passed enabling a spy satellite to go up, a Japanese indigenous spy satellite. In 2001, right after 9/11, in fact, the Japanese revised their Coast Guard law, and the first act of the Japanese Coast Guard after that was to sink a North Korean ship. It was the first act of hostile fire by the Japanese since the end of World War II. That ship went down. And, of course, this year, in July, on July 4th, no coincidence that, the North Koreans had missile tests in the East Sea, they would call it. In the Sea of Japan, the Japanese would call it. And the Japanese responded with a diplomatic success in the United Nations on sanctions. And again, earlier this month, when the North Koreans tested their nuclear device, again, the Japanese responded with very hardline rhetoric, but got the Chinese and the Russians, of all folks, to go along with a repudiation of North Korea. So this is a catalyst made in Hollywood. Okay, there's China. A couple of things to say about Chinese-Japanese relations, and I can't possibly do justice to it and still have Q&A, so I won't try. Simply to say both countries are tired, really, really tired of this. The Japanese are tired of having been giving to the Chinese development assistance, enormous amounts of technology, enormous amounts of investment in China. China is Japan's #1 trade partner now. This is not the United States, China. But they're tired of doing those things and not getting any friendship out of the Chinese. They're tired of being accused of being war criminals. They're tired of the demonstrations in the street. You may remember the Asian football championships in 2004 when Japanese diplomats' cars were turned over by Chinese who were responding to the very idea that Japan would beat China in the Asian football championship. But they were responding to other things. They were responding to Japan's efforts to get into the permanent member of the Security Council, and they were responding to the things that they're tired about. So what's China tired about? China is tired about the visits to the Asukuni Shrine by the Prime Minister of Japan. He promised he would go every year, and sure enough he did. And then he took a long, sharp stick, and he poked it directly in China's eyes because he went on August 15th. August 15th is the date that the war ended. So they're tired of that, and they're tired more generally about the inability of the Japanese to be more like the Germans, which is to live with their war responsibilities intergenerationally. That's what the Chinese have been looking for, say some Chinese. The Japanese say, no, that's not what they're looking for. They're simply looking to stir up anti-Japanese sentiment as a way to prop up their own authoritarian regime. I think there's truth in both of those things. But the fact is the Chinese are tired, the Japanese are tired, and there are outstanding territorial disputes. I mentioned the Senkaku, the Diaoyutai dispute. The Chinese are concerned that the Japanese have tilted too hard in favor of Taiwan. That's the third rail. It is truly the third rail of Chinese, both domestic and international affairs. All that said, there's plenty of incentives for accommodation. I already talked about the fact that it's the largest trade partner now, but also the basic complementarity at this point in history of the Chinese and the Japanese economies have been recognized by virtually everybody, including Prime Minister Koizumi. They have common interests on the. I shouldn't have added that last bullet point because I've already got it. I did that last night. Sorry, I was tired. It was a long day. Common interests on North Korea. They do share some common interests on that. They do not want a nuclearized peninsula for different reasons. It's not that the nuclear weapons are going to be pointed at China, but the refugees will be, and so they want to pacify the peninsula. But above all else, and really the most important thing, is that there's no one in Japan, no one, not even the most right-wing nationalist, not even the Uyoku no Uyoku, the far-right, violent rightists, really believe that they have some fundamental privilege, some inherent privilege to dominate the continent anymore. That's just not it's not on the table. Yamagata's ghost is gone. That's not what Japan is, not by a long shot, in my view. To the extent the Chinese get it, there are more incentives for accommodation. So where is it all going? First thing is there's a surprise. There was an October surprise this month when Mr. Abe, upon becoming prime minister, the first thing he did was something that new prime ministers have never done before in post-war Japan. New prime ministers have always gone to the United States first. He went to China first, and then he went to Korea. And while he was in China, it's reported that he said the right thing about the Yasukuni Shrine. By the way, I presume you all know a little bit about the Yasukuni Shrine. If you don't, ask me, we'll talk about it. I'm really happy to talk about the Yasukuni Shrine because there's a lot of it's very relevant politically about the shrine. In any event, Abe was reported to have said the right things to the Chinese leadership, both by his advancement and then him in person. And it made for a very positive meeting, and that was very helpful. Then there has been reform of the Yasukuni and the Yushukan. Yushukan is a museum. It's a reliquary on the grounds of the Yasukuni Shrine. I'm going to just take a moment. I presume a lot of you, maybe all of you, have been to Japan. How many of you have been to the Yushukan Museum? Oh, not that many. I'm surprised. Okay. We'll talk about it. Yushukan is filled with memorabilia from the war. It's also filled with explanations for the memorabilia that are, repugnant. If you're Chinese, Korean, or even American, some really strange interpretations of the war in the Yushukan. Well, the Americans began to complain about it recently, and they've made changes. So the explanation that was in the museum that said that President Roosevelt started World War II to trick the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor. And he did it because the American economy was in a depression and he needed a jump start to the end of the depression. That's what it said up until last week. Well, it doesn't say that anymore because finally our ambassador, Tom Schiefer, actually visited the Yushukan and said, whoa, we can't have that. So the Americans complained and there have been changes. The Chinese and the Koreans have been complaining for a really long time. No changes made. No acknowledgement that they've got a problem here. So until that happens, we're still going to have a problem. It's about history and how relevant history still is in international politics. In any event, you're beginning to see reform. And the biggest, most pressing issue in terms of reform of Yasukuni is what to do with the enshrinement as martyrs of Showa of 14 Class A war criminals. Very complicated, not an easy problem to solve, not an easy problem to take one side or the other on in some respects. We'll talk about it, if you like. But Abe, before and after he went off to China, did something else which surprised those of us who see him as, remember I described him as coming from the far right of the party that had consolidated power. He was very pragmatic. He said, first of all, my grandfather had war responsibility. He'd never said that before. His grandfather being Kishi Nobusuke. I've meant to say, Kishi was not only one of the founders of the LDP and one of the leading revisionists, but his grandfather ran Manchuria for the Ministry of Commerce and Industry and for the Japanese Imperial Army. And so he was 3 years in Sugamo prison as a Class A war criminal, unindicted. So his grandfather has a checkered past. He embraced the United States, and the United States embraced him in the 1950s, and he became a good friend of the United States. His first words, reportedly after coming out of jail, was looked around and changed his clothes, literally changed from prison garb to his mufti, and he looked around and said to his brother, Sato Eisaku, he said, "We're all Democrats now, aren't we?" And sure enough, they were all Democrats. It doesn't come from a deep democratic tradition, let me just say. But he also accepted the statement by Murayama. Murayama was the prime minister, socialist prime minister in 1995, 4-5, who issued an apology to the Chinese and to others in the region for Japanese war, for the Japanese behavior during the war. Mr. Murayama's apology had to become, he was prime minister. It wasn't passed by Diet. The LDP refused to pass it. And so he had to issue it as a personal apology. And the question that was being asked of Mr. Abe all summer long and into the fall when he became prime minister was, well, is this government policy or is it not? He embraced it. And embracing it was something no one expected him to do. He hadn't ever done it before. So I say Abe as a pragmatist, one of the nicer surprises, if you're looking for accommodation between China and Japan, you're looking for something beyond stalemate and a standoff in the region. The alliance, let me just jump to this. The alliance issues, let me just talk about, rather than give you the sort of the intellectual superstructure, which is about entanglement and abandonment, which is the intellectual, it's the superstructure of any alliance relationship. Japan leans a little bit toward the United States to avoid the United States abandoning it, and as it does, it has to start worrying about getting entangled in American adventures. America is at war, has been at war for a lot of the last, say, 60 years. And Japan has always been in fear of getting dragged into an American war. That was the story in Korea, it was the story in Vietnam, and it's been the story certainly in the Middle East. But the Japanese now have elected to discount the problems of entanglement to avoid abandonment. And so they are hugging the United States very closely and being hugged back. This is a British phrase, hug them close. It's Tony Blair. And the Japanese fancy themselves the Great Britain of the Far East and are hugging in much the same way. In any event, that doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory in the alliance relationship. There are some serious problems. The United States is realigning its forces, and in the process, there are questions about the extent to which the forces with the Japanese would be integrated, whether or not they could get joint basing, whether or not the Japanese are paying enough, even though they're paying more host nation support than any country in the world, whether they're paying enough. In May, after a series of negotiations about Okinawa, the Americans said, we are moving 8,000 U.S. Marines, the third MEF. We're moving them to Guam. And the Japanese, who had been asking, many Japanese, particularly in Okinawa, had been asking for that move for a very long time, celebrated. But then the Americans added, and it's going to cost you 3兆円. That's $26 billion. And $26 billion is, it's a fair amount of money, even for the world's second largest economy. And Abe immediately, he was then chief cabinet secretary, distanced himself from the agreement. And so they have to be careful what they ask for, because the Americans may, in fact, move. And if they do, it's going to cost them, and it may leave them feeling abandoned. And if they do, then there's all sorts of new responsibilities that they have to assume. The biggest issue is the bottom of this chart. Have I been in your way the whole time? Are you all right? Okay. Now I'm worried about it's one of my last slides. Sovereignty. If you're on the left in Japan or you're on the right in Japan, it doesn't matter. You are concerned that the war has been over for 60, 65 years, and the Americans are still on your soil. And you can gussy it up, you can make it look as pretty as possible, put a smiley face on it, you can do a lot with it, but the fact is you're feeling that there's a reduced amount of sovereignty and that it's humiliating. And the Japanese talk about that all the time. And they talk about it openly, more openly than ever before. I think sovereignty is an increasingly important issue in the U.S.-Japan alliance. When a helicopter went down in the middle of Okinawa, in the middle of a university in Okinawa, imagine we're sitting here, there's a quadrangle right there, helicopter came down, okay? And they had Americans circling it with yellow tape and telling Japanese police that they couldn't come in and do anything. So that was front page news for a very long time. It's the extraterritorial privileges that the Americans continue to assume, we Americans continue to assume in Japan, that is, it rankles a lot of Japanese. Not everyone, and I don't think we exert exceptionally large amounts of extraterritorial privilege compared to what might have been in the past, and we're conscious of it. Nonetheless, it's a problem, and it's going to continue to become larger until and unless we can negotiate a more equal treaty. And I think that's either the status. I have SEICO down there, but I really have in mind the status of forces agreement that hasn't been renegotiated since 1960. I don't have time for this slide, but this is basically this. I guess I have to have time. What time do I go to, Wade?
Well, we have 12 minutes until the formally ends.
Oh, ouch! I should stop. Oh Lord! Look, this is my depiction of the debate in Japan today. Make no mistake about it. Whatever I said to you before about the consolidation of power here, there is a serious, deep, active, substantive debate about national security in Japan. It's joined on all sides by those who think that the United States should be hugged, and those who say the United States, we should not worry about entanglement, we should worry about abandonment, and those who say, no, we're going to get entangled in American adventures, and they want to keep distance from the United States on the one hand, and those who say the use of force is okay, we're a normal nation. We should be a normal nation. And those who say, no use of force, Article 9, strict interpretation. And when you do this, you see that right now, it's the guys in the upper right quadrant, the normal nationalists, who have consolidated power, but they are not the only game in town. And if they don't get that balance right, and if they don't really work to the advantage of Japanese security, it is a democratic country. It is a profoundly democratic country, and it's one in which you're going to see change. And it could change either toward more the autonomous. These are the guys who would go nuclear tomorrow if they could, and they're really worried about sovereignty more than anything else. Or go back to what used to be. What used to be, let me go here first. This is what used to be. The mercantile realists, the guys who are tethered to the Constitution, who would roll back Japan to the very limited senshuboi, limited defensive defense role, and are very comfortable being junior partners of the United States. Versus upper left, armed neutralists who want nuclear weapons, they want reach out and touch capabilities, and eventually they want autonomy. That's what neo-autonomists want. In Japanese it says jishuboi, autonomous defense. They want to be able to say no. Now, Japan hasn't been able to say no. I'll tell you what and the normal guys I've already talked about a bit. Whoops. Okay, let's go back the other direction. I may use up all 12 minutes with this, huh? I apologize. Here's what I think is going to happen. I don't think the normal nationalists are going to win everything they want and do it in just the way that they're going about it. I don't think the autonomists are. I don't think we're going to go back to mercantile realism. I call it a Goldilocks consensus. What I think is going to happen, what I expect will happen, because Japan has a robust democratic politics, because there's intra-party and inter-party dynamics in Japan, you're going to see more distancing from the harder lines, the harder edges of the debate, so that the people who, as a pragmatism, now I didn't expect Abe to be the pragmatist. You notice I already identified him as but this is a pragmatic kind of solution. I have to explain this to the Japanese. Goldilocks? What's Goldilocks? Americans, we grew up with the story. But the point is, it's not too hard, not too soft, not too far, not too close. Getting it just right. Finding that balance in the debate in the posture vis-a-vis the United States, but more importantly vis-a-vis China, that Goldilocks is going to have to find. I didn't expect Abe to be Goldilocks. I expected, like most analysts, that Abe was going to take Japan further to the right, and that the reaction to Abe was going to be Goldilocks, and he was going to pull things back. Abe seems to be playing this role. So what's the posture? And this is truly the last slide. That Japan would be a Japan that can say no to the United States and sometimes will say no to the United States. It will be normal, but it'll be normal like Germany is normal, or Canada is normal, or France is normal, not like Britain. Britain's not normal. Britain always says yes, right? And Japan always says yes. So those who say Japan's going to be the Britain, that's not what I think's happening. That Japan will be very well armed, but not necessarily nuclear armed unless the American security guarantee becomes non-credible. It'll be armed for deterrence with the United States, and also, more important than anything else, for counter-coercion, to be able, on the high seas, to protect against coercive measures by hostile powers. And in that end, toward that end, the Coast Guard buildup, which I didn't talk about, but said I would if you asked, Coast Guard buildup is very important. And I think overall there'll be a very robust hedging policy. That's what I mean by Goldilocks. The end. I'm sorry I went so long, and I hope there'll be questions that we can enjoy answering. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
As Abe, the new prime minister, has he given any indication of his stance towards Yasukuni?
I'd have to repeat the question.
Okay, the question was, has Abe made any public statement about a change in his position on Yasukuni? And the answer is yes. The difference is between a position that Koizumi had, which was, I promise to go every year, to a position where he says, I'm not going to make any promises. That's a difference. What he's saying is something that's more acceptable somehow at home. Japanese people are split, as I suspect you know, right down the middle on Yasukuni. Should the prime minister go, shouldn't he go? 49, 51, 51, 49, they're split. And what he said is, I'm not going to make this easy for the Chinese. Basically, that's the subtext. What he said is, I'm not going to take a position on this. But he's a very strong supporter of Yasukuni. Again, Kishi, his grandfather, was one of the leaders of a major shrine in Manchuria during the war, and he's inherited a lot of the responsibilities. He's been very pro-Yasukuni all along, but he has backed away from the more hardline Koizumi position. And there's a huge irony in this, because he is ideologically comfortable with Yasukuni. Koizumi had never gone to Yasukuni before he became prime minister. Never did. And suddenly he becomes identified with a hardline pro-Yasukuni position. It was very opportunistic politically, but that was about it, not ideological. Yes, sir. Voices. Oh, okay.
We hear about the preoccupation of China with the militarization of Japan, and we see the relation with the United States. What about Europe and the rest of Asia? How do they see that? Are they worried about it, or what's their attitude?
Worried about the militarization of Japan?
Yeah, or this
Yeah.
more open attitude towards defense.
The United States is worried to the extent that it's not militarizing enough. The United States has been pushing Japan very hard for a very long time to do more. I don't think the Europeans care much, to be honest. I've never seen any indication that the Europeans care at all about the remilitarization of Japan. The Americans, of course, do, and the Chinese, as you said, care enormously. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Why didn't the United States help Japan's membership in Security Council?
Why didn't it?
Yeah, I know U.S. Because
Yeah,
of China, maybe?
Yeah, that was a mystery. That was a mystery to me, because the hypocrisy of the American position on that particular issue was really out there for everyone to see. The Americans say, we support you, we support you, we support you. And then as they got close to the vote, the Americans, and they didn't need to, because China was going to do the heavy lifting for the United States. China didn't want the Japanese in the Security Council. But even before China would weigh in formally, the Americans said we're opposed to it. Formally, the reason for the American opposition was they didn't want to expand the number of members by 4. That was the formal explanation. They didn't want Germany, Brazil, and India in, along with Japan. So the explanation was it would be okay if it was just Japan, but all these other countries, it would change the dynamics of the Security Council. Bad idea. But the Japanese didn't read it this way. They saw it as perfidious behavior on the part of the Americans, and frankly, it sure looks that way. Yeah.
Also, yesterday, 3 days ago, the ambassador Schiffer
Mm.
gave a speech in Japan
Mm.
saying you calm down about trying to become a nuclear country.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that?
Yeah, I mean, Schiffer, the
US government?
yeah, the administration is of one voice on this. That the administration is on one voice, which is that it does not want Japan to become a nuclear power. They see it as very destabilizing in the region. The moment Japan becomes a nuclear power, things get ratcheted up very vigorously with China, with Korea. We lose. I mean, Korea ends up hugging China even more closely than it already is. And so, yeah, there's a whole set of dynamics that the United States government doesn't want to see put in train. Yes, sir.
This is kind of a big issue, but I'm wondering also about non-security foreign policy. How much of an ally is Japan, or should we expect Japan to be with the United States on economic issues or promotion of democracy issues and things like that?
No, it's a great question. The poster child case for that whole issue is Iran, it seems to me. I don't know how closely, or whether you had that in mind when you were asking. I actually had an Iran slide in here that I took out. I should have taken out more slides. Here's the situation, okay? Iran. The Japanese, 15% of Japan's oil imports come from Iran today. The United States has sanctions on Iran, extraterritorial ones, in fact, Iran is rapidly becoming a nuclear power, and Japan is between the rock and the hard place. In Japanese, say itabasami, between the pincers. And it's a real problem for the Japanese. On the one hand, they are committed to the non-proliferation regime, the NPT. They've always said, as the only country to have suffered, the pain of a nuclear attack, we are steadfast in opposition to the proliferation and the creation of new nuclear powers, and we will be the leader in the world on this. They say this over and over again. But then there was Iran publicly flaunting the nuclearization issue, and Japan holding back because of the oil. Japan had negotiated for 75% ownership of the largest undeveloped oil field in Iran, maybe in the world, known reserves in the world, Azadegan field in Iran. And the Americans, about 2 years ago, we began saying to them, look, you got to, these are bad guys, and the axis of evil, you can't play with these guys. It's, not good for the alliance, folks. But the Japanese didn't believe that the Americans really meant it. The Americans probably didn't really mean it because the alliance is too important for other reasons. But push has finally come to shove, and under the cover, and this is to Moises' question, because here's where the Europeans really got involved. It was on Iran. The Europeans started shouldering the burden of getting the Iranian nuclear problem fixed. And once they started in, then the Japanese came in. And what happened was, as recently as about 2 weeks ago, the Iranian government and the Japanese negotiations on Azadegan ended. The Japanese reduced their ownership from 75% to 10%. They didn't shut the door completely, but they did. And so all last year I was in Japan writing this book, and I was always asked the question about Iran. What are the Japanese going to do if they have to choose? And I interviewed 15 different people, Diet members, cabinet ministers, on this issue alone. I mean, I interviewed hundreds last year, but on this issue. And every one of them waffled. No one answered the question straight. And until a couple of weeks ago, there was no straight answer. Now it looks like the straight answer was, if we have to pick one or the other, we stick with the United States. But there's still 10% of the oil field. I think it's a hedge. I think it's a hedge. So you're hedging on the economic side, and you're hedging on the military side, and you're doing them separately. And if you're interested in a fuller development of that argument, I did a piece in Foreign Affairs with a colleague of mine, Eric Hagenbotham, a few years ago, called Japan's Dual Hedge, and I try to lay out how that works, what the dynamic is.
I see there are still several people who want to get in on the conversation, but we've reached the end of the hour. I think, if you're willing to take a few informal questions afterwards,
Sure. That's up to you. You're in control of my schedule going
I know,
forward.
in control. Exactly. But please, let's once again thank Dick for the stimulating talk.